Good morning. Today is Tuesday, May 26th in the year 2020, and we are going to continue our study of the book of Genesis, starting in chapter 37. In particular, we're going to talk about Joseph today. Joseph's story is one of my favorites, always has been. A very interesting tale. One that has a little bit of popular misconception in it, but that's okay. We'll deal with that as we come to it. So, beginning in Genesis chapter 37, Jacob lived in the land with his father, stayed in the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Now, we spent the whole time last week talking about Jacob, and now we get the title, The Account of Jacob, but this is really the account of his son, Joseph. Joseph, a young man of 17. All right, first of all, often in pictures, we see Joseph as a young boy. He's 17 years old, and not quite, but almost a grown man. Tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. So he's a tattletale. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. He made a richly ornamented robe for him. Okay, not a coat of many colors. That was a mistranslation a long time ago. Splendid or ornamented is the most likely translation. If we think about nomadic desert cultures today, the favored person, the high-ranking ones, wear white. And so it is likely that what Joseph was given was a brilliant white cloak. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream. When he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to the dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood up, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brother said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. He had another dream. He told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." He told his father as well and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Joseph is a prophet, but obviously not a particularly wise one. You don't tell everything you know. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flock near Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, "You know your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." He sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the field and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They have moved on from here," the man said. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went to his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns, and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes to his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him in this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. Why would Reuben be interested in this? Well, if you'll remember, Reuben had slept with his father's mistress. And possibly this was an effort to get back into his father's favor, Reuben being the oldest. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing. They took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. They sat down to eat their meal. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, now let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hand on him. After all, he is our brother and our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" They got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph must surely have been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son." So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, we have a kind of hiatus that we leave aside the story of Joseph. We return to Judah. And one of the things we're going to do is when we look at Judah, this is an account that shows up in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, but not something probably that a lot of people like to talk about. At that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam near Hira. There Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. He married her and lay with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son whose name was She conceived again and gave birth to a son named Onan. She gave birth still to another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight. So the Lord put him to death. When Judah said to Onan, "Lie with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as your brother-in-law to produce offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so whenever he lay with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from producing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death also. Now, contrary to the way this is often interpreted, particularly by the Catholic Church, Onan's sin was not that he spilled his seed on the ground. Onan's crime was that he refused to give his dead brother offspring. It wasn't the fact of the spilling of the seed, it was the circumstances. This is what we call a levirate marriage, although in this circumstance that term would be a little anachronistic. Rather, it is the idea that a brother would provide offspring for his dead male relative, his brother in this case, by the man's widow, so that his inheritance would continue. Onan didn't want to produce sons for his brother, so he took advantage of the situation but did not do his duty. That was his crime. Was a violation of family obligation, not the spilling of seed. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up," for he thought he may die too, just like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in their father's house. For a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah to the men who were shearing his sheep. His friend Hira, the Adulamite, went with him. Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear sheep." She took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, then sat down on the entrance to En-Naim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she thought that though Shelah had not grown up, she had not been though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute. She had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside, said, "Come now, let me sleep with you." "What will you give me to sleep with you?" she asked. "I'll send you a young goat from my flock," he said. "Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it?" she asked. He said, "What pledge should I give you?" "Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand," she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her. She became pregnant with him. When she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend, the Abdullamite, in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. He asked the men who lived there, "Where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road of En-Naim?" "There hasn't been any shrine prostitutes here," they said. Okay, little explanation. A lot of the fertility cultures of the ancient Near East and elsewhere maintained shrines, and the priestesses of those shrines were often prostitutes. I'm sure it was a popular and lucrative business, but theologically, the reason was that the reenactment of the gods' actions to produce fertility would, in a way, be a prayer to them to increase the fertility of the land. Thus, a shrine prostitute. Now, in this case, there was no shrine, and that didn't seem to bother Judah. And when he goes to get his seal, very important object for the man, back, discovers, oh no, there is no shrine here. Went back to Judah and said, "I didn't find her. Besides, the men who live there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute there." Judah said, "Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughing stock. After all, I did send her this young goat, but you didn't find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution. As a result, she is pregnant." Judah said, "Bring her out and have her burned to death." She was being brought out. She sent a message to her father-in-law. "I am pregnant by the man who owns these," she said. She added, "See if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are." Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah." He did not sleep with her again. The time came for her to give birth. There were twin boys in her womb. She was giving birth. One of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it to his wrist and said, "This one came out first." But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, "So this is how you have broken out." And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread around his wrist, came out and was given the name Zerah. Perez means breaking out, and Zerah means starlet or bright. We don't teach these in Vacation Bible School. We like to skip over the ones about sex, but sex was a big part of the ancient world and is part of any world, any culture. And the reason Tamar, even though she tricked Judah into having sex with her, is considered righteous, is because she fulfilled her obligation to her first dead husband. She produced offspring for him from his own family line. Judah says that he is less righteous because he failed in his obligation to help her produce children. in for his dead son of the son's own family line. Now a more famous story, but also one that involves lots of sex, or the potential for sex. Now Joseph had been down in Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the household. He entrusted to the care everything he owned. The time he put him in charge of his household and of all he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So he left in Joseph's care everything he had, with Joseph in charge. He did not concern himself with anything except for the food he ate. Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." He refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. Now then, could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. One day he went into the house and to attend his duties. None of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to him, "this Hebrew has been brought to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." She kept his cloak beside her until his master came home. She told him the story. "That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me. But as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house." When his master heard the story his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me," he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Oh, but while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those who held in the prison, and made him responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. All right, just a few comments there. First of all, if you're captain of the Pharaoh's guards and your wife said, "This slave boy tried to rape me," do you put him in prison or do you kill him? Certainly, you had the legal right and authority, and nobody would have doubted that you were justified in your actions. He grew angry and he put him in prison, but you have to wonder if Potiphar didn't suspect his wife of a degree of infidelity in this issue, and so spared Joseph's life. The other thing we see here is a pattern of ups and downs in Joseph's life. Joseph begins the favored son, is a slave in a pit, rises to become the head of Potiphar's house, is falsely accused and winds up in prison, winds up in charge of the prison, and we will see from there how things go. Lots of ups and downs in Joseph's life. This is a really fascinating and dynamic story. People who talk about the Old Testament being boring, I just don't get. This is certainly as dynamic as any modern drama, full of sex and violence, of lies and deception. It just takes reading it and imagining what's really going on. We'll return to the story of Joseph tomorrow with chapter 40 and find out what happens to Joseph in prison and after. Until then, be safe. May the Lord keep you.